I think the one thing you can't avoid that comes down to is there is some kind of intrinsic feeling that remains, that whereas the Nazi regime gets it wrong for horrible and the worst possible reasons, somehow every single time that the communists had control of a country and turned it into dust, it was somehow the product of good intention.
Yeah, well, there's a universalism about the communist ethos that definitely isn't there on the Nazi side, because the Nazi claim is, this is for us and definitely not for you. And so the exclusionary principle is built right into the beginning, where right at the beginning. Whereas on the communist side, at least in principle, if not in reality, the coming utopia was for everyone. And there was the song of the brotherhood of man, and the idea that people could be included regardless of their origin. So that seems like part of it, is that there's an evil built into the principle itself that the Nazis that ran with, that is absent with the communists. But the truth of the matter is, to some degree, that it didn't matter, because the tally of bodies was equivalent on both sides of the equation. And so even if there's the lack of a certain toxic principle at the outset of the communist doctrine, it doesn't make it one whit less catastrophic. And it might even be worse in some sense, because you can't put your finger on it. Now, my sense is that a line crossed on the left is equality of outcome. And it's part of the identity politics pathology. There's something wrong with, first of all, there's something wrong with construing the world as if your group identity is paramount. That's bad. That's a non-starter. Now, it's not so easy to exactly say why.
Funnily enough, of course, that is being pushed currently on the left, but it will, as you said before, benefit the right parts of the right in the end.
Oh, definitely, definitely. And because there's just no reason for the right not to capitalize on that. It's perfectly...
There's an unbelievable own goal that's being created, a horrific goal opening down the road here.
Yes, definitely. Well,
we can all see it coming.
Well, as soon as you allow, as soon as you say, well, yes, your group identity is paramount, then you allow people who say, well, not only is it paramount, it's superior. Right. Well, that's not that much of a transformation of the perspective, especially when you're also saying to certain groups that you should be playing to lose. It's like, well, because anyone sensible is going to look at that and say, well, why shouldn't I play to win? If group identity is paramount, why shouldn't my group just win?
Those people you can identify as being on the far right these days, and the people that are, the few people that have got this massive press attention for being called alt-right, you notice one thing in particular with them: they flirt with the dangers of fascism. They flirt. You can see it when they're caught on video. They like to drop in terms that resonate. They flirt with fascism, they flirt with Nazism. And this is rightly something we pick up on, and our ears are attuned to it. In London, where we're sitting last week on a morning television chat show, a young woman who was invited on got into a row with the presenter, and he was portraying her because he supported Trump and she was anti-Trump. He said, well, you know, since you loved Obama so much, she said, I didn't love Obama, she says. And she says, I'm a communist. I didn't love Obama. I'm literally a communist, you idiot. And this, as we speak, has become not just enormously popular, but gigglesome on the left in this country. And I'm not talking about the far left. I'm talking about the left right up to and involved with Her Majesty's opposition. I'm literally a communist has just been made into a T-shirt by a group on the left, and they're selling it. And this in an era when we've been endlessly told, you know, the only thing you do if you see a fascist is to punch them in the face. And there seems to be, as I've always said, a supply and demand problem with the fascists. There aren't enough for the demand there seems to be to find them. But yet, here you have, live on television, I'm literally a communist. And it's unimaginable. We all know it's unimaginable that somebody would say, I'm literally a fascist on TV, and everyone would find it wonderful, and everyone would make I'm literally a fascist T-shirts. So this 20th century era, this educational era, seems to me to be having real-world consequences of a kind that...
catastrophe. It means that we learned half the lesson. We sort of learned half the lesson of the 20th century, right? And well, thank God we sort of learned half the lesson. But the other half has not been learned. And that's not acceptable, not in the least acceptable. Yeah, the idea that you can... Well, you know, the data in the United States indicates that 1 out of 5 social science professors are self-proclaimed Marxists. It's like, you're a Marxist? Really? Like, seriously? Yeah, not only am I a Marxist, it's one of the things that makes me morally virtuous. Well, what about the 20th century? Well, that wasn't real communism. It's like, and I know what that means. It's the most arrogant possible statement. What it means is that, well, you know those people who tried it before? They didn't really have the same nuanced understanding of the sophistication of Karl Marx's revelation that I have, or the moral character that I have, so that if I had been placed in charge, let's say, of the Russian Revolution, the utopia, that was only a couple of decades away. That's what it means.
I once wrote about this with Eric Hobsbawm, the famous left-wing historian who just shortly before his death was asked in an interview by Michael Ignatieff that if it took another 20 million dead to have achieved full communism and the state he wanted, would it have been worth it? And he replied, yes, It would have been worth it. Again, unimaginable that this could happen in the opposite direction. But particularly unimaginable still this idea, even after the 20th century, that these Marxists, literally a communist people, still are standing on the piles of tens of millions of skulls saying a bit more violence and we might yet get to utopia. It's an extraordinary...
Always one murder away from utopia. One more murder away from utopia. Well, you know, and the way that the leftists defend themselves is by saying things like, well, what about all the deaths created by capitalism? You're not factoring them into the equation. And then, of course, the problem there is that most systems manifest themselves in various forms of bloody excess. And so how you tally up the bodies depends on where you draw the boundaries around your conceptual systems. And you know, if you include the entire history of the Western expansion into the New World, say, over the last 400 years, and you decide that that's a manifestation of Western capitalism, let's say, then, well, the tallies, I suppose, they look different.
And at the very least, you can say that the number of people raised out of poverty by capitalism is significantly higher than the number of people raised out of poverty by communism.
Well, this is. I think there's something crucial about that, because one of the things that we will have to contend with is something like that, which is that every system is, in some sense, a system of oppression and bloodshed. But some of them also produce a modicum of wealth and happiness. And I would say that that's the proper defense of what has been established as a consequence of the primacy of the individual in the conceptual schemes of the West, is our bloody oppressive system at least produces some modicum of wealth and well-being, whereas the communist system produced, if you're optimistic communist, no more deaths, which I believe is wrong, but zero wealth and a tremendous amount of collateral destruction. And so it could easily be that we're in a position where all we have to choose from is horrible systems, some of which do some things right now and then. And that would be our system. That would be the Western system. And I think there's plenty of evidence for that too, accruing evidence, because what's happening right now across the world is that as the idea of individual sovereignty and associated property rights and freedom of choice and so forth are increasingly instantiated in developing countries, those countries are moving away from conditions of abysmal poverty at a staggering rate. And so, like, the right-wing types have to admit that hierarchies do dispossess and that they have their elements of brutality about them. even if they're functional hierarchies, even if they're competence predicated, they dispossess people. This is the cognitive problem in large part that's going to bedevil us over the next 20 years. But I mean, at least there are fewer people starving now. There are more people being lifted out of absolute poverty. Child mortality rates, child mortality rates in Africa now match those in Europe in 1950. It's like, that's cause for celebration. And we have halved the number of people in absolute poverty since the beginning of the millennium. And so I think we have to grow up and be realistic and say, well, yes, there are, all human systems of governance and organization are pathological to some degree. But some of them are minimally functional as well.
An optimistic, pessimistic note on which to finish. Thank you.
Thank you.